11 and Kyle Settle is coming here to meet me. So if he shows up at the very end, that's why. Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take one giant book, break it down section by section, bit by bit, talk about it, analyze it, have fun. This season, we are doing Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. And I should say that we are the only books podcast that celebrates both the Nobel Prize and opening day of baseball. But we'll get to the baseball thing in a second. I want to welcome two special guests today. The first is Emmett Stinson, who is the Associate Professor in Literary Cultures and Head of the School of Humanities at the University of Tasmania, based in Hobart. His most recent book is Murnane, which was published in 2023, which closely examines Gerald Murnane's last 4 novels while also providing a broader introduction to his work. He's also published the chapter, The Economics of the Literary Novel in the Cambridge History of Australian Literature, and the article, Self-Publishing Highbrow Literature in Contemporary Literature. He has co-written one article on Alexis Wright and Goodreads in the journal Textual Practice. Anyways, he says in his bio, I will not talk about any of this boring stuff on the podcast, but I'll bring it all up. So Emmett, welcome. How are you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. Very happy to be here today. And just wanted to say as well, as we often do when we start meetings, both in person and online here in Australia, that I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking from today. I'm here in Hobart, Nipaluna on the island of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Palawapakana people. This has been a place of storytelling for over 30,000 years, and so it's really exciting to be able to talk about books and literature here today and honor that tradition in this chat today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. And also joined this time by frequent guest of 2-Month Review and sometimes occasional co-host, Kaya Straumanis, who is currently in Iowa, where she is the translator in residence and has an Airbnb in which there are books on the shelves versus the new Open Letter office, which is completely bare. But here we are. How are you doing, Kaya?
Yes, hello. I'm doing well. I had my second workshop of the week yesterday night, so now for the next 2 days, well, until next Monday, I'm off doing my own stuff.
And what are you doing?
I am the project I am working on while I am here is the book that I got the NEA grant for many moons ago, before the world was destroyed by COVID, called Forest Daughters, and it is about essentially about the female participation in the national partisan movement in Latvia in the 40s and 50s.
Very cool. Very cool. How is the translation coming?
I haven't gone back to what I've translated so far. I just finished kind of rereading the book. And it's really heavy shit. So, I mean, I've kind of gone back into living my best night owl life. So I'll be up until 3 a.m. reading these really kind of harrowing, depressing memories from these old women who are interviewed, and then trying to fall asleep.
Oh my God, yeah.
And then wake up in the morning and get ready for workshop. So maybe not the best choice for 5 weeks away from the family and pets. It has not been relaxing.
But at least you're getting time to do the work that you want to do, and that's fantastic.
And the workshop's been so fun. I've been parsing out recently that this is the workshop class that I'm teaching is one of many workshops that they're doing, and that I think it was either not explicitly clear or I did not look into it. So I'm understanding that the students are already super burnt out, and a lot of them are defending their theses in the next weeks. So I kind of switched my tack to like, we're going to throw down and do cold reads, to like, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for dragging your tired asses for another 3-hour workshop. But it's been really fun. The students have really interesting pieces, and they're all really, really like, I want to bring each of them home to Plube with us, because they've all been really, really cool about the cold reads and really into it. And I cannot stop staring at Emmett's cat.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone listening to this and not watching us live on YouTube, Emmett's cat is draped across his shoulders and looks very comfortable.
It looks so comfortable.
He is. It's his I'm not a cat person, but I was chosen by a cat, so that's
very chosen. So
I was cold, yeah.
So we do. Today is a big celebration day because it is the opening day of Major League Baseball, the official opening day. There were 2 games played in South Korea last week, including one in which it was unveiled that Shohei Ohtani may have gambled $4.5 million, or it was stolen by his interpreter, or he was paying off his interpreter's debts, or there's been a number of stories. All of it's super fascinating and relates to this podcast in the sense that Ohtani had no idea what was going on because his interpreter is not interpreting everything or letting him in on what people were saying. And until like there was an announcement and Shohei's like, the fuck's going on? And they're like, oh, you lost $4.5 million. So anyways, today is the official opening day. So I decided that it would be that for our Australian fact of the podcast, that I wanted to see how many Major League Baseball players there had been from Australia. The total number that have played any amount of games is 34. So there've been 34 Australian baseball players. That's not bad, right? It's more than I expected. 17 of them had a positive WAR or wins above replacement. 17 of them have a negative WAR or wins below replacement value. So not particularly great. Their total WAR, if you sum them all up, is 41.65, which is approximately like 5 seasons of Shohei Ohtani. So they're worth 5 Ohtanis as a country at this moment. But in addition to this, I thought we would play a game. So I have in front of me 5 names of Australian baseball players and 5 Indigenous Australian authors. According to Wikipedia, I have no prior information on any of these people. So I'm going to ask you a pair of names and you have to guess who the baseball player is. And we'll go back and forth. I have 5. You could do 4, but 5 could be the tiebreaker. So with that in mind, who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll go because it's going to be very embarrassing when I get it wrong. So right, so let me go. Yeah. Okay.
Here's a tough one. Both I try to choose as many of these that they both sound like baseball names or they both sound like writer names. So here we go. Cameron Kane Cross or Leopold Glass. Who is the baseball player?
Leopold Glass. I'm guessing. I don't know.
No, you are wrong. Cameron Kane Cross, a very famous baseball player who played for Cleveland for 1 season. He is the baseball player. I tricked you though, and I chose this one just to trick you because Leopold Glass is a pen name for Bruce Pascoe.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Which I figured that might be the known name, but he also wrote under Leopold Glass. So that was a tricky one.
He's very famous for his book Dark Emo here, Bruce Pascoe. But yeah.
Is Kane Cross hyphenated?
No, it is not. Okay. I think it's Karen Cross, but I'm not sure. They do have a pronunciation guide here, of course, but I'm not looking at that. Okay, Kai, you're up. Okay, Chris Oxspring or Ronald Rowe? Who is the baseball player?
I want to say Ronald Rowe.
No, Chris Oxspring. Chris Oxspring played for, hold on, you got to come up here, San Diego. He pitched all of 12 innings. He is not very popular or good, whereas Ronald Rowe actually wrote a book on Kunin Law, Crow and Country, and a letter to all First Nations. So particularly pertinent to today's conversation. So Emmett, back to you. How about Kevin Gilbert or Grant Belfour? Who is the baseball player?
Kevin Gilbert?
No, Grant Belfour is the baseball player. Grant Belfour is actually the second best Australian baseball player according to WAR, to play. And Kevin Gilbert is a dude. He was the first Aboriginal playwright and printmaker. He was an active human rights defender, establishment of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in 1972, and well as various protests to advocate for Aboriginal Australian sovereignty. So again, a good match for this one. So far, this is harder than I thought it would be. I'll give you a semi-easy one. Herb Wharton or Peter Moylan?
Is it my turn?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Okay, I'm also watching Emmett's face to see if there's any recognition of either name.
I know, me too.
Wharton was one of them?
Herb Wharton and Peter
Okay.
Moylan.
I'm gonna say Wharton's the writer.
Wharton is the writer.
Yes.
Yes, he was a former stockman, so he also relates to this book in certain ways. Taking care of animals, the stock, but he also wrote poetry and yarn-like novels, is how it is described in here. Okay, final one for the tie to you, Emmett. This one's crazy, and I guarantee I'm not pronouncing any of these words right. Okay, Wesley Enoch or Warwick Sapoid.
Wesley Enoch is the baseball player.
Wesley Enoch is the writer. And yeah, Wesley Enoch is the most baseball sounding name I have ever come across. Like Wesley Enoch, he was an Australian playwright and artistic director known for The 7 Stages of Grieving, co-written with Deborah Mailman. He's also the artistic director of the Queensland Theatre Company. Whereas Warwick Saupold, or however you pronounce his name, he was a pitcher for the Detroit Tigers, and he was not good either. He pitched an 82. He pitched how many innings did he pitch? Where did it go? Oh, there it is. He pitched a total of 106 innings for a combined WAR of 0.7. So quite not remarkable, but wonderful name, wonderful name. So thank you for playing books or writers or Australian baseball players with me. And now we can actually get into the meat of this conversation, which I want to start, Emmett, not with Alexis Wright in particular, but just because we were throughout this, if you've listened to the episodes, anyone who's been following along, we have continually butted up against that we don't know much about Australian literature. Like I know a handful of writers, but not really the context. The context for this book is sort of we're grappling and grabbing for it through looking things up, trying to make sense, and also focusing on the text as best as possible. But I was wondering if you could just give a brief introduction to Australian literature, as much as you want to get into, and Alexis Wright's position within that.
Yeah. Look, obviously a large field to do all of. In an earlier episode, you compared Australia to Canada, and I think that's actually a good comparison. We do a lot of kind of benchmarking for the book industry and things like that with Canada, both similar populations, similar country size, 2 populations, stuff like that. Both post-colonial countries that have a very similar kind of history. And so, Australian literature in the 19th century is very much colonial literature. It's often looking towards England in various ways. There is a notion in Australia called the cultural cringe that was created. That was a term that was coined in the early 1950s, and it's the idea that Australians were embarrassed of their own cultural products because they were always worried about what cultured British people would think. And then the idea is at some point maybe they started looking towards the US and being felt shameful about Australian works or underrated them to some degree. So there's kind of an embattled question around Australian literature always, and there can be a sense that we don't always recognize our best writers locally, that people have to go overseas to get recognition in some way. So we've only had one Nobel Prize winner in Patrick White, and it was a huge thing that he won here. But a huge thing in the sense, it kind of notably wasn't a huge thing in the media, weirdly, at the time. That I've read some stuff about that recently. But it was so that's one of the weirdnesses of Australian literature. You have this kind of colonial past. We didn't really have modernist literature in the way that kind of other things. It happened sort of later here in the 50s and 60s. You kind of get it. There are some writers like Christina Stead who are very much in the Camp Eleanor genre, people like that. And then you get this kind of explosion in Australia in the 60s and the 70s of a new generation of writers who very much were very cosmopolitan and outward looking. We're playing with forms. We're very into metafiction in particular. And you start to get a kind of an opening up of literary form and a move away from realism. Patrick White famously described Australian literature as dun-colored journalism, is what he said, more or less. So So there's this idea that Australian literature is kind of very straight, very, very naturalistic or realistic, and was belated, kind of missed modernism. The other famous thing here is, of course, we had the Ern Malley affair, the hoax, where there was this fake modernist poet created by two Australian poets named James Macaulay and Harold Stewart. They created a whole biography and a suite of poems. They sent it to this modernist journal, who published a whole issue about Ern Malley, who never existed. And John Ashbery has gone on to write poems as Ern Malley. He's become this kind of figure. So there's this sort of very, like this kind of strong anti-modernist, anti-experimental sort of streak in Australian literatures is the idea. So Alexis Wright is kind of an interesting one, because she is, she's as an Aboriginal Australian author, as a Wangi woman, as a quite experimental and complex writer. She seems to sit very strangely in this kind of broader tradition. In some ways, though, I think her books have always interacted with and referenced the broader Australian tradition. So Carpentaria, which is the novel that made her famous, won the Miles Franklin Award, which is itself quite an embattled and weird literary award, but the most kind of like the Australian Pulitzer. Or National Book Award, whatever you want. But that kind of references a Xavier Herbert novel from 1930 called Capricornia. So it was like a clear attempt to kind of reference that name and that novel. So she's always kind of engaged with that tradition. And even this book, in the way that we kind of have this sort of narrative voice and we're following around these different people, you can actually go back and look at a novel like Joseph Furphy's Such Is Life, which is this book, has one of the great opening sentences in all of literature. The opening sentence is just "unemployed at last!" ! Great opening line. But it's this character going around in New South Wales and Victoria and talking to sheep herders and stockmen and all these different characters who kind of tell different stories. But it's this really garrulous, verbose narrator. It's almost like the narrator is Melvillian, and then he'll go talk to these people, and unfortunately he'll try to render their accents, and it's like really unbearable to read those sections. But the overarching narratives are like really verbose and kind of overblown and weird and silly. And so there are ways, where I think even I don't know if Wright thinks about Furphy or likes Furphy, but I can place her in a kind of a broader Australian tradition that does actually intersect with that colonial past. And I think her work has consciously placed itself in response to that, in the case of Carpentaria in particular.
That's really interesting. That's really helpful and really interesting. So because those are two authors I'm not familiar with at all. Patrick White, of course, heard that. Then Christina Stead, but I don't know, those two are below or out of my radar. You've read a couple of her books prior to this. You were saying before being on. I guess, so you said you read the Swan book and Carpentaria, and that Praiseworthy was on your list, and now you're reading along with the podcast. How does this compare to the other two in terms of style or scope?
Look, this is actually this has been my favorite of her books so far. But that's because I think it's the weirdest of her books. I think it has had, I think kind of, prior to this book, if you talk to literary people in Australia, Alexis Wright has had kind of the highest Q rating, whatever it is. Like, you say Alexis Wright, and everyone's like, I love Alexis Wright. She's great. Like, no one, versus like Gerald Murnane, who people talk about, have talked about a lot. If you talk to Australians, most people are like, Gerald Murnane, he's so boring. Hate him, boring. And actually, when I was writing the book, I did have people say to me like, "Oh, Gerald mundane," stuff like that, that's kind of this, and that's kind of the stock. That's the response I kind of expect when I say Gerald Murnane to people in Australia. They're like, "Ugh, not him." Versus Alexis Wright, people are like, "Oh, I love her." This book has I think divided reception a little bit more. I think it's been maybe less of a slam dunk in its reception thus far, because it's really iterative and strange, and things don't kind of align in the way you expect it to, and it keeps repeating things, and you're not always sure why it's repeating things. And it kind of takes elements of Carpentaria and the Swan book and does other things. She also wrote another really long, big book that won the Stella Prize, which is the other kind of major prize here, called Tracker.
Right.
Which it's huge also. And it's an oral history of Tracker Tilmouth, So to me, this book, it's like, so the Swan book is this post-apocalyptic novel that's all about climate change in a remote community. So it kind of takes that bit. It takes the different narrators from Carpentaria, but then I think it really does draw on the kind of oral history stuff from Tracker as well and kind of expand this kind of really expansive telling and retelling sort of thing that's happening in the novel. And I like it because I just think it's totally bizarre and it's great. And I have absolutely no clue what it's going to do in the next page or next 10 pages at any point. And I love books that are like that, where I have actually no idea what's going to happen at all at any point. So I love it. I'm totally hooked on this one, but it is a very odd book.
I agree with that. It's very odd for all the reasons that you're saying, especially the repetition thing where you're like in one place for so long. But it's true, like it can switch like even paragraph to paragraph. Like I feel like the section we went over today, which was I think it was from 197 to 264, something. It ends at 264. It ends at the end of the second oracle speaking, which is the chapter entitled "The Censor." And this one, I could try and sum it up. I'll try and sum it up. Kaya, of course, is not reading along, so she's just going to jump in here as things go.
I've listened to I listened to one, if not two, episodes of the podcast, though, so I know a little bit of the things that are going on, mostly relating to donkeys.
That's what I was going to say. You had a question about donkeys?
Yeah. I first of all, I was just looking to see, because I didn't bring the copy that you set aside for me, Chad. That on Simply E, so through the New York Public Library, I reserved Praiseworthy, the ebook, but I removed it because it is available for checkout in less than 4 months, and I'm then number 29 in line for 5 copies.
Whoa. So
this book is, it's only 5 copies, but that's 5 ebook copies, and all of them are checked out. So I think that's pretty good, pretty good praise for that. But yeah, my question was, Emmett, how many donkeys have you shot?
So the hilarious thing, and I had to check this because I heard about the feral donkeys, and I was like, do we have a feral donkey problem? I didn't know that. I knew we had a feral camel issue in Australia. There are feral camels everywhere, but there's like hundreds of thousands of feral camels in the north, but I didn't know about the donkeys
in the north.
So I asked an actual Australian, not a fake Australian like me, my wife, and I was like, do you know about the feral donkeys? And she's like, what do you mean feral donkeys? Where are there feral donkeys? She had no idea. So I don't think that is widely known. But part of this is like Australia is one of the most urbanized countries on the planet. Half the population lives in Melbourne and Sydney, and basically everyone else lives in these cities around the edge. So one of the things to realize about Praiseworthy is like, and Australians actually don't travel in their own country all that much. They love traveling around the world, but not so much in Australia. So talking about remote Northern Territory, like no one's been there statistically, just as a fact. So there's a kind of an exoticism to this novel, even for Australians. This is, friends from the US used to like say to me for years, like, oh, do you see kangaroos? And I was like, I don't see kangaroos. Now I actually have 3 wallabies that like live in my yard and I see them every morning, but that's only happened since I moved to Tasmania. So like, I haven't seen kangaroos. Otherwise we don't have, so that's one of the things that is this kind of exotic book even here.
Yeah. So how quickly did your wife deny knowing about the donkey problem?
She's actually,
is it immediate? Cause has your wife killed some donkeys?
No, just the opposite. Actually, she loves donkeys and has gone to donkey rescue farms and has tried to organize her work to go to them in the past. So she was like, "Wait, they're feral," and I was like, "That must be why they're all the donkey rescue places because of all the feral donkeys."
Okay.
So it clearly is a thing, but just not. I don't know. I don't think it's there in the national consciousness.
She's on the live collectors end of it as opposed
to
that's on the wall. Okay.
Yeah.
That's so cool. That's really good. Good on her for that.
I mean, we do have several packs of donkey jerky in the house, as every household does.
As every household does.
That would be delicious. I bet. I would try some donkey jerky. 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10.
So there is the general question for you about like what things about Australian culture that we might not know that you've encountered in the book that might help like frame things. And related to that as a second part is like I can kind of see and read about and assume, but the relationship between like the Australian government proper and the Aboriginal societies. I'd be curious to hear your perspective and not just like what I'm seeing online and interpreting through the book.
So I mean, so this is set during the intervention, which I think you've covered pretty well in terms of the broader politics. That when that happened, it was seen as, you know, kind of quite a cynical thing when it occurred. Certainly by people on the left, people were very upset about the intervention at the time, and it was kind of seen as a sort of an easy target in a way for kind of a populist beat up, really. So it was a very divisive thing. And we still see it now, you know, just literally yesterday in Alice Springs, which is in the Northern Territory as well. They've instituted a curfew for people under the age of 18 for 2 weeks because of some violence that's happened there. So these kinds of eruptions and government interventions happen all the time. One of the things that I think is really important and is clearly going to become more important in this book is the notion of native title, which gets referenced a lot. I don't know if you're aware of that. That's quite an important thing. So in 1993, there was a Supreme Court case in Australia, and the Supreme Court here is not like the US Supreme Court. It's not very interventionist. So it was a big deal when this happened. There was this big court case called the Mabo case, is what it's known as. And in that case, it asserted that that First Nations people in Australia actually have native title. They have the right to access traditional lands that they have a continuous and unbroken connection to. That's the threshold, which is quite a high and complex threshold. And native title can mean different things. In some cases, it can mean exclusive access, where you actually get to, you get to kind of occupy that land in the way that we often think of in a Western sense. In other cases, it might be just access to do ritual or to have other kinds of connections with the land. But the big thing for that is it overturned this doctrine of terra nullius, or nobody's land. That was, when colonization happened. That was the basis. In fact, there's a book that's just come out written by 2 Melbourne academics about the first book of poetry in Australia was written by this judge who apparently was also the first person to invoke terra nullius as well. So they've written a book about that, and even better, his name is Barren Field, which is incredible that he's kind of the note Barren Field. Yeah. So that's Justin Clemens and Tom Ford have just written a fascinating book on that topic. So that's a big thing. The other thing here is, the history of colonization is a really live and complex thing. Our version of the 4th of July is Australia Day, which is January 26th, which actually refers to the day that the first fleet arrived in Australia. So it like literally celebrates colonization. And there's been a long campaign to change the date of that because it is quite offensive. A lot of people refer to it as Invasion Day. First Nations peoples are very upset that is the Australia Day date. So there's a lot of very complex political stuff happening. Some other, I think, kind of very if we're talking longer histories, and this does come up a little bit in the book, I think, with Aboriginal Sovereignty's wife, who's taken away into custody, and it's never quite clear what that means, what she seized. The other big thing here is the notion of the stolen generations in Australia, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one either. There's a movie there have been some films about it that have happened in the US, but kind of between 1910 and as late as the late 1970s, in Australia, governments, churches, and welfare bodies were forcibly removing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from homes, and they often would rehome these children with kind of, with white families, but they actually ended up kind of doing forced domestic labor. It's like really bad. So removing people from their families, removing them, and this happened for, again, 60, 70 years. And there have been a lot of government reports about that. So part of that thing about Aboriginal sovereignty's wife being taken away, as it sort of references this, is there's still an ongoing problem where for the children of First Nations people are removed at a much higher rate than
Mhm.
the population. And the other kind of one of the other big political issues is about deaths in custody, in particular, where Aboriginal peoples experience much higher rates of death in custody than the rest of the population. And those are some other I think kind of big political things that are forming the backdrop of this. But Wright likes to talk about this in her work. The Swan book as well. The second half of the novel very much involves a man who becomes the first Aboriginal president of Australia. So she's very interested in playing with these kinds of tropes around politics. It's a big thing in her work.
And like, what's his name, wants to become the first billionaire.
Yeah,
billionaire.
Yeah, and Tommy Hawk, who wants to be adopted by the blonde-haired Minister for Indigenous Affairs in Australia as well. Yeah.
Wants his blonde mommy. That's what we're talking about. The other, before we get, like, we could talk more specifically about parts of this section. It's always kind of tricky to talk about this because not a lot happens. Like we're saying, like, there's not a lot of plot. It's a lot of like recirculating of ideas and like retelling them and making certain jokes and whatever. But before we do that, you have a Bluey fact for us. And since we are also the only books podcast in which cucking and Bluey are in every episode, tell me your tale.
Yeah, well, look, no, the thing I was just saying to you is the weird thing when Bluey came out, it was this kind of thing that people started saying about it, because there's the dad in Bluey.
There is the dad in Bluey.
The voice actor, he's kind of, look, I mean, my youngest kid was watching Bluey today, so I'm exposed to it constantly. I've started wearing kind of one of those radioactive protective suits whenever he puts it on, so it's okay. But he was the singer for kind of in my view, a not particularly great but semi-famous Australian band in the 1990s called Custard. That kind of was like I don't know, kind of like pulp or Blur, but not as good, kind of in that sort of vein of things. So, and in fact, the original theme song of the show was actually a Custard song. I think they only did it for one episode, but yeah.
That's wild.
That is a great Bluey fun fact. So
there you go.
And so cucking very popular in Australia. Is that
it's huge? It's all we talk about. It's yeah.
Want to come over for some chips and crackers, some wine and some cucking? Let's do this. That's the common greeting.
BYOC, bring your own chair.
Sadly, the national food in Australia is even sadder than that. It's actually a sausage, like on a barbecue, a sausage in a piece of folded over white bread. That is like the national thing that people eat. It's really
that's what I feed my child when there's no groceries left in the house.
Yeah. Straight up did that last night.
Now I can say it's ethnic. I don't know.
yeah, exactly. We're just appropriating Australian meat culture. I don't want to say meat culture again either.
You should say meat culture often. Did you guys see that there's now, I don't know if it was a joke or not, but there's apparently like a Bluey version of like Blue Apron or HelloFresh, those meal kit services, but it's Bluey inspired. I don't know what that means, if they just slap the Bluey paw on it, but I saw that last night.
Kids will eat it if it's Bluey related.
That's true. I hope it's like filet mignon with like a shallot marinade, and it's like, well, Bluey eats it. Oh wow, now.
Eating a shallot.
It's just sausage and white bread.
This is off topic but related to the food thing. There is a woman named whose Instagram is like My Jane Brain, and she makes recipes. She's like an influencer slash chef, question marks all around that. I believe she is from Canada, but she has moved to either New Zealand or Australia with her friend Emmy, and that does all these videos too. And she is now doing Australian recipes that include using Vegemite on steak and all sorts of like bizarre shit. I will link to her profile in the show notes, because watching her is like watching an ad for mental illness and intervention, where you're just like, okay, this is why those helplines exist, and that sometimes people need a little break because she's not okay.
I mean, the funny thing is Australians are actually quite like food obsessed with like food is actually very good here, and they're very good cooks, and like their coffee culture. People are obsessive about coffee culture. It is completely insane. I love coffee, but still completely insane how obsessed people are about it. But so then that's to me why it's so jarring. So you get that, and then you get you go to a barbecue and someone hands you a sausage and some white bread with some fried onions on top, and then they ask you, do you want barbecue sauce or ketchup on it? You're like, oh, neither, none of this, none of the things you've handed me. I hand this back to you. I don't want anything to do with it. But yeah, so.
Oh my God. So perfect. So let's talk for a minute about this. So what's your impression so far? You've kind of talked about it, but about your impression of the book was in relation to this section. We have Aboriginal Sovereignty essentially goes out to the sea. I don't know that he's dead, to be honest. And I may have just missed that, but there's that moment where Tommy Hawk is like, oh, I could tell my dad where the turtle is and what the name was, and he's out at sea and blah, blah, blah. But I'm not going to because fuck that guy. And meanwhile, the dad's like, stupid little fascist, always talking about his iPads and wanting to get adopted by the white people. And he's horrible and he's a stupid fascist. I told you he was a fascist when he was a baby. And the mom's like, bro, you can't call a baby a fascist. Like, that's not cool. You're not going to make it on Bluey if you keep calling our son a fascist. And that's sort of essentially what happens in this area, in this part of the
he is kind of a fascist. Maybe that's the other bit that's hilarious. And that is like you can't say that, but maybe the dad's right. Also, it's yeah.
You can 100% call your baby a fascist.
Yeah, you can. You definitely can. That is definitely an option.
I have not.
I have not either, but he is, Tommy Hawk is, because he is always talking about the pedophiles and how they need to be the intervention, and everyone around there is gonna touch him, and all the bad stuff is happening. That's why he wants to escape, and yet he's stuck there. And I still love, I don't think it's as much in this section as it was in last week's, but where he's basically like, this fucker's getting out first. Like, why? I want to get out of here. And like what you're saying, like the relation between the distance between all the towns, the metropolises that are where most people live, and these remote things, that was sort of clear to me, but I don't think I really thought of it and framed it in that way, that this is like truly like kind of not inaccessible, but like not something that you would just be like, let's go vacation there, or go see what's out there. And so his need to escape or desire to escape to a big city is so much more pertinent within that context, so much more like intense.
Yeah, it is. So you know, areas like this can be incredibly remote, incredibly cut off from things. So that bit of it is entirely plausible, in fact. And there's a lot of Australian literature has played with that. Gerald Murnane's kind of most famous novel, The Plains, is about this idea that there's this kind of great culture of landowners in the center of Australia who want to fund the arts, which is a joke because there's nothing like that in the center of Australia at all. And that the whole book is kind of based around that inversion. So, a lot of work in Australia does. And one of the comments about Australian literature is that too much of it historically is focused on the bush, on the kind of the hinterlands, when actually everyone lives in the cities and basically always has. So that kind of bush writing tradition is a big thing in colonial lit, and even in the early 20th century as well.
Is it like a romanticism of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so one of the most famous Australian short story writers, and one of the most famous Australian writers, is a writer named Henry Lawson, who would write these kind of funny, laconic, and ironic stories about the bush. That's very much part of this romanticism. Then there were writers like Barbara Bainton, who kind of wrote these sort of early feminist Gothic sort of underminings of that kind of tradition as well. So it's both romanticized and then de-romanticized and then romanticized again, and then that's that in a never-ending cycle.
Back and forth. That's interesting. Did I miss any major plot points? I'm trying to look back through this that you want to bring up.
I mean, and you've talked about this. It's so the other thing that's hard in this is that, and I think I'm slightly ahead because I'm reading the Giramondo version, which is got a slightly different page count as well. So I don't know why that happened. I did know you noted the other week that Mika Chu, who I didn't know well but knew when she lived in Melbourne, at New Directions, changing the book slightly. In fact, Australian novels are regularly altered to some degree when they go to the US market. They change the metaphors in particular, and a lot of Australian authors have complaints about this, where they've had to change very specific cultural or sporting metaphors for US audiences. So that's actually quite a common practice.
That's interesting, because that seems so weird to me. I don't know why. It's like,
well, because we have Bluey.
Yeah, well, now we know it all. We have
everything makes sense.
We got everything. We're America, man. We can fucking do this. No, that does seem so weird to me, but there's a great article by Jason Grunbaum, the translator from Hindi and professor at the University of Chicago, in the book In Translation, about how he translates Hindi books for an Indian-based publisher audience versus an American, and what kind of slang and sort of things you can leave in there that would be absurd if you translated them into English for the Indian audience, but make no sense if it's not over here. But I don't know that, I didn't think that Australia would be that extreme, that it would like require that sort of intervention to like map over. So I'm really curious. That's really interesting too, because the interior of this book, there's so many widows that are driving me insane, where I'm just like, this is wild. I don't want to keep crapping on the production of this book, but like, look at this motherfucker. This is the end of a chapter, and it's just
no.
And my note just says, God, Jesus fucking Christ, get better. Like, but it's like, apparently late night Chad was grumpy when I was reading this.
That's not very Bluey of you, Chad.
No, but I was sitting in a chair in my bedroom, so it was good.
We have a chair in there now?
You don't want to come home. The other thing, I did have one other big question, because this starts to crop up here when I talked to Stefan Tobler, and he told me about this editing process. And I mean, I don't know how we'd figure out like what was exactly changed without asking, but he referenced like all the evangelical parts of this book, or the churches. And I was like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And I don't think we've gotten there yet, but there is like a huge reference on 237 where it talks about all the holy assemblies argued the toss about which preachers were the best in the world. They did not notice blah, 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 blah. And there comes up like all this stuff about religion all of a sudden. And I don't know that I know anything about the religious background of Australia. Like if it's like Protestant, Lutheran, something different, like totally, like I have no idea. And I see that it's starting to pop up here a lot, where it seems like there's people with their different beliefs or different religious systems. In fact, the title of this is one line is Devotion to Off-Grid Religions, which I thought was a great phrasing. But yeah, what is the
I believe Catholicism is the largest religion here. It's not a particularly religious society in the way that the US is, and often religion here would be correlated very strongly with very specific kind of social, with being conservative in particular. In fact, I remember when we met a couple from the US who were very religious and were not conservative, and Australian people were like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. I was like, this happens all the time in the US. People are religious and they have all different beliefs. It's not a problem. It's not a thing. It's not something we talk about. We don't fight about it. We don't discuss it. It's just fine. And that is not really as much the way it is here. It obviously happens, but it's not as common here. So it is in my view a more secularized society. We have had religious prime ministers and things like that, but a lot less of that here.
So your former prime minister didn't launch a new program yesterday in which they're selling $59.99 copies of the Bible under the title "Make America Pray Again"?
Well, we did. So actually, the last prime minister here was in fact quite religious. That was in a Protestant evangelical. He's part of Hillsong. If you're familiar with Hillsong, I don't know. It's a kind of an evangelical. They have like rock concerts at the church kind of thing, and a coffee shop out front, that sort of thing. So it's one of
religious social club.
No, but there's some complex things about that, but that would be a bit of a detour as well. Let's say the complex things about them would fit in with some of the claims that are being made about the communities here in the book by the Australian government, right?
Okay.
So, yeah. So anyway, yeah. So look, it has cropped up, but that's fairly unusual for Australia. You don't get that. Look, it's more like the UK than the US in that respect. That would be a good way of understanding it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's why I was wondering if like this is going to be playing with at some point from Stefan's like stray comment and a couple of things in this section, if it's playing with that idea of the religious people coming into the community or setting up within the community, and that would be really could be really inverted. Like one of the things that you pointed to so far that I think is valuable for reading this too is those kind of inversions that seem to be taking place and that we've kind of tapped into that in terms of like people's reactions are always funny and weird, where like with the brother not giving a shit that Aboriginal sovereignty is drowning, and it's just like, I'm not going to help, I'm just going to eat my chips, why isn't this going faster? Like the reactions are all kind of backwards, but I see now that maybe like even some of the overall talking is kind of inverted, like you're saying. Like it's not, it's playing with what the real structure is and sort of shifting it.
I think that's right. And like people describe her writing as allegorical, and maybe it is, but I think it's too complicated to even be allegorical, because I think, to me, it's that kind of Dostoevskian thing of like, here are the big ideas. I'm going to put these things out there, and I'm going to keep reversing them and reversing them and reversing them till you don't even really know what I think anymore very, very clearly. But look, I mean, it's also, I think she is also portraying debates that happen, within and among Aboriginal peoples in Australia as well. Talking about assimilationism, talking about sovereignty movements, talking about the complexities of the politics around this, and these are things that came up during the referendum, as well. Though according to surveys, the vast majority of Aboriginal Australians supported the yes vote. There were notable critics of it as well. Often people who wanted stronger things. They wanted treaty, they wanted sovereignty, they wanted constitutional recognition of a much stronger kind, and felt that that this was an assimilationist kind of gesture. Again, that was a minority, but so these were voices that were out there during that debate as well.
Interesting. So I know we're getting close on time before I go to before I have to go teach. And since, as you mentioned at the beginning, you're 15 hours ahead, it is now 2 a.m., I believe.
So 2 a.m. here, yes.
Yeah, which is wild. Which thank you again for staying up so late to do this. But I don't know if is there any other sections of this that you wanted to talk about in particular or bring up in terms of this particular, whatever it was, 60-page section. So otherwise, I got some lines I really liked. I do think that it's funny that I hinted at maybe this was kind of a joke that Aboriginal sovereignty is committing suicide, and it's playing with the idea of the name versus the concept as a whole. And there is a line on our page 240 where it says, like, they'd not even mind living in a slack shack of government failure if they could recognize Aboriginal sovereignty as being all things, if only Aboriginal sovereignty could be returned to them. And it started to play with the idea of like, he's gone, but it's all gone. This is gone. Now we have like to reconfigure things. And I thought that's funny. It is a good joke. It is set up like kind of like beat by beat there, and it works. But
and maybe he's been turned into a sea turtle. So that's the other possibility. Maybe he's not dead. Maybe he's become a sea turtle. It's very unclear, right? That's
anything's possible. There's lots of moths in the sky too.
Yeah, lots of moths as well. Yes. I think I ended up slightly ahead of where we were in the section, but one of the sentences that I liked best, which I think is maybe slightly ahead of this, that I marked, is just at a moment where Cosman Steele is arguing with his wife about Tommy Hawk and how he's going to be the way he is. And it was this sentence. He said, he would have preferred her to reply, to show some solidarity as a parent of her mongrel child, that what he was saying was correct and was the truest thing he knew, that their child was learning white shit at school.
Yep. No, that's in the section. I have that whole page marked. I'm exactly on the same thing.
I'm glad it was in the section. But I love that line, and to me, those are the kind of things in the book where I like, where it's this kind of very complex thing, and then scatological or swearing or just whatever at the end. This kind of great sort of collapse of that. And I mean, one of the things that I like about her writing, and that I think fits in with a kind of Australian tradition, is that I don't look. I think she's a fantastic writer. I don't think she's like a when I think of writers who are stylists, I often think of like that Nabokov or like, I think someone like Gerald Rennie. These people kind of write these, Proust, these kind of pristine, sort of complex sentences. And what I like about her work is that I actually think she's not a stylist like that. It's digressive and everywhere, and
Yeah.
she moves high to the low, and it's not these perfect kind of sentences that you can read out and go, oh, that's beautiful. It's actually about the movement between all the different things that's hilarious and funny, which is great. But I think she can even be a bit purple. It can be too much. It can be not perfect. It's not always perfectly refined. It's about moving everywhere and being too much. And that's what I like about it.
Yeah, that's what I like too. Specifically that kind of woolliness and orientation. It does hit those moments where I'm like, I don't know that I know what this means, but then just kind of like let it go and hope that like it'll be repeated in a different form. But some of the phrases are just like really fun. Like when everyone gets pissed at Cosman Steel, like they always are, right? And they're widespread and like they're always like getting upset about his schemes and the relationship to the cemetery, which I'm still sort of puzzling out. But they're like it's referred to here. Where did it go? I just had it open. There's just like two little lines. Yeah. So the word spread about how nobody knew who this Cosman Steel was anymore. He was history blanked, canceled. And I just love he was history blanked. Is such a great little turn of phrase.
Yeah, it is. And that's I mean, it's like a little purple. It doesn't quite work, but it totally works at the same time. And that's what's really great about it. And so the cemetery is an important one because that is part of the native title claim, I believe, as well in the book. So I think there are a lot of jokes happening there with the cemetery, with traditions, with elders and ancestors, and with native title. And so, I think there are a lot of different ways of reading the allegory of what it means to be living in a cemetery. And the other thing is, of course, the cemetery is quite literally, the murders of colonization and the people that were eradicated. So there's that benefit too. Yeah.
Right. When you're talking about the native title earlier and the needing to be in that space, like unbroken or whatever the scheme was, like the cemetery came to mind then as like being one of the places where they are always there and would be the land. So yeah, where they live in like Carpentaria has the same thing of like, living on the fringes and like the junkyards and in like those kind of spaces. So that sort of like homeland part, definitely not Bluey in this book, and is very unique. So I do have my line of the week. As we start to wrap this up, I got to figure out where we go to next week. But my line of the week is in our section is on page 243. It's this whole paragraph. Well, praise like to thank God for taking the good for himself in front of their own eyes and leaving them rubbish people to deal with. The combustibles with catastrophic vision like global warming. Boom, boom, boom. The good get taken, shit stays.
That's great. That's great.
Which I like. That's back to like the shits parts are great to me. Like the use of the word shit so frequently in here is like a great cuss.
Yeah.
And did you have a different line of the week that you wanted to plug?
I read mine earlier, which was the white shit line, the learning white shit. That was in it. So a very similar kind of one there. Absolutely. The other thing, of course, with native title in the book is that you have the different characters trying to fight with each other over native title. That's the thing that happens in the book, which is quite hilarious as well, and different from the kind of presentations that we often get. So that's a funny thing. But yeah,
that's perfect too. So for next week, what we are reading is the entire next section, Moth Opera, which in the American edition goes from 265 through 336. So it's just that next chapter, in which the Oracle 3 is Speak Like a Wise Man. So I'm kind of keying on that Oracle part 2 is like how it seems to be like Oracle speak, and then the next time is like Oracle make more sense, and then this time's like Speak Like a Wise Man. Like I'm curious like how that affecting the style, even if it didn't seem like radically different between part 1 and part 2. There's like maybe a little bit different focus. And it did initially become a little bit more crisp on like, here's a setting, here's an event, and then got murky later on. But thank you so much for doing this. Is there anything that you want to plug of your own work or anything that you think people should know about?
No, I mean, we plugged the Murnane book. If anyone wants a book about Gerald Murnane, this one is called Murnane. So yeah, recommending that one. Yeah, that's what I'll plug.
Were you on the Beyond the Zero podcast to talk about that?
Was, yeah.
Perfect. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. And Kai, anything you want to
add? Nope.
Good. Go
Except
Cardinals.
What?
Go Cardinals. Otani's innocent. Free Otani.
Yeah. Also, there's a little bit of not sadness, but Iowa City's a little quieter today. Now that the women's team has moved on to other games in other places. Yeah.
Hashtag love Caitlin Clark. Has to win it all for my women's bracket. Help me out. But they had a tough game. She's got to come through. She can do it. Tomorrow, I think they play tomorrow, but they might play on Saturday. Anyway, so yeah, time for the tournament, time for baseball. And thank you both for coming on and doing this, and and have a good week.
Thank you.